Good afternoon and welcome to PayProp's Rental Trends webinar. We are going in another installment as to what has happened over the last quarter. We started this rundown at the start of lockdown and looked at the first quarter of March, April and May. We've done two subsequent editions, this being the second one looking at that third quarter and saying what has happened to our rental trends in the UK over September, October and November. What we're typically going to be looking at here is what has happened in the run up to us believing that furlough was coming to a stop. We made certain assumptions in the webinar that we relayed in September that we'll now be checking how they've come to pass. We also took the opportunity on this. We've noticed that a sentiment change had happened within the rental market. So we decided to use this webinar to also carry out a survey. This survey was carried out not just to PayProp agents. What we wanted to do is get a view of those agents that are using PayProp and aren't. Often when we're giving this information, there's a certain view that as they are all PayProp users, are we getting a certain view of the market from people that are placed to deal with this in a remote fashion? But how is everybody else in the industry feeling about the rental market, the ability for people to pay, and what they see as the future as we go out of 2020 into 21? Now, when we actually looked at that, we also felt it was vital for us to actually look at the tenants and the landlords. Unfortunately, to gain that express permission so that we could deal with it in a GDPR compliant manner, we have only been able to go to tenants and landlords that do use agents that are powered by the PayProp system. But the agent information is looking at whole of market, but we have still gone to tens of thousands of properties where we've been able to speak to the tenants and the landlords and gain their sentiment as to how they're feeling about the rental industry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this share, and we're going to, as usual, we'll start this off with the actual arrears positioning and look at what's happened over this last quarter. Now, just a little bit of keeping with the data that we use. So when we've taken this information and we're looking at the arrears data that's come through the PayProp platform, we are only dealing with residential clients who have processed funds in the whole of the 11 months of the year so far. So not just the people who it was since lockdown in March. We've actually run this, they've got to have been processing from the beginning of the year up until November. And then we haven't taken frequency into account. Where people are on recurring invoicing, we have used the assumption that the frequency has remained constant. Now, there may have been isolated instances where people have moved from quarterly onto monthly or on monthly onto weekly, but actually as a small, it is a minor percentage of the data that to look at the frequency of invoicing would have made no real changes. And when we look at the arrears position, we've taken that as of the 20th of the month, because what we actually find on that money movement is where we start seeing the run up into the demand again. That is the lowest point of processing. And so what we wanted to do is use that low point of processing as the source of when we look at the data. So what's happened over this last quarter? Well, if we look at the percentage of tenants in arrears, what we can actually see is when we did this in September, we believed it was going to have a run up spike where we would notice a higher percentage of tenants in arrears that may be caused by the runoff of furlough. We'd already in August seen that as a highest number of redundancies. And because of that, we were already starting to see that growth happening in September. Actually, what we are noticing is a shifting of that debt. So actually, it's good news that the percentage in tenant arrears has fallen in both October and November. We do need to look at what may have happened regarding the lockdown. Because while the lockdown happened and started in March, the impact we felt in April and then in May. With most rental contracts being paid in advance, it is sometimes the following month. So the lockdown that we just experienced that finished at the beginning of December, we may not feel the impact of that until December or into January at the next report. But it's fallen to its lowest levels since the lockdown. So the lockdown in March, we were at 9.6 and we're now at 11.8. So back below where it was in April. What we can see here is that we had the September spike. In isolation, as we say, according to the Office for National Statistics, at the end of August, 11.3 people per 1,000 were actually unemployed. It's the higher level of redundancies that the UK has faced in over a decade. So that may have given some of that. And remember, August pay packet is then what pays September's rent. We're still looking at whether this will continue. So while arrears are on that downward trend, will we expect this to last? What are we seeing in the other? And when we come on to look at the regionals, you'll see how the devolved governments having different lockdowns and dealing with lockdown in a different way has played out differently in a tenant's ability to both remaining paying their debt, but also pay off their shifting arrears. So when we actually look at it as a percentage of the overall rent, so what we're doing here is we're looking at how, and we can see that same tracking downward trend that we saw within the arrears. It is taking longer. So the average percentage arrears continue to drop from its high at 127 to now being 121.1, which doesn't seem a large shift when we say that in May, which was our last height from that first quarter, it was also at 121. But it means that we're seeing some of those smaller drops in the average arrears. Now, when we look at that, what could it be that is actually allowing it to creep down? It could be that in the future, we are seeing tenants continue to drop the average amount as the hardcore of late paying tenants that have been struggling to pay the debt have either moved on and have come to arrangements, or have now found ways to cope with the way that we're having through in coronavirus. What we noticed is during the second set of lockdowns, a larger percentage have remained in the workforce. Now that could be because it was right up until the end of furlough believing that it was going to be removed before we were told that it was being extended and that people could be placed back on. And so for a lot of people, that decision may have already been made. There could be speculation that it's down to what we're seeing with the courts opening, that actually has some of that persistent and some of that persistent pre-lockdown debt be what we're actually seeing being paid off. Until we get further information, and we know, unfortunately, with another freeze on lockdowns, it's not something that we're going to be able to play and give that true information. So what do we look at if we now look at the movement? What is that telling us? Because it's fine as looking at this as overall, but what has actually happened at the grassroots on a month level with those percentage tenants in arrears? And what we can actually see is almost a matching pattern between the amount of the increase at the start of lockdown in March and where it was in April to that payback happening in September, October, and October, November. So when tenants are getting the opportunity, they are paying back that arrears. When the pandemic first hit, everybody was struggling to adapt, and we saw that big increase. But what's remained consistent through this second, and we don't know the full impact, but it has seemed to be consistent, is that those tenants are now finding ways to cope, to make those payments, and to keep that arrears into a manageable level. Will it continue? That's what we don't know. As normally we would see a bump around Christmas and New Year anyway, seasonal crunch time for personal finances. So we may see arrears increase and start to overtake that decrease again at the start of 21, especially with personal savings net being at such a low level. And I'll come on to explain why that's such an impact, but there's some statistics that have been brought out that during this period, we've actually been living off of savings. So the true picture of what may have happened with redundancies and where we are with debt may not be being felt everywhere within the market. And it's the same when we come to look at your average arrears as a percentage. I mean, it's great that we can see that it's remained static, but we've got the same number increasing as decreasing. What we've actually got is sort of this seesaw effect that's happening. So this is hidden in those headline figures, which only show a small decrease in the average arrears percentage. But instead of just this small decrease, what we're instead seeing is half the tenants increasing the debt, while a slightly larger set are decreasing their debt, which averages out at that small decrease nationally. And when we come and look at the different plays out in the regions, then you can start seeing why people are arguing at a political level, maybe the impact of what the different tiers and the setups and the different devolved governments putting different things in place. Because while we may look nationally and see that decrease, certainly when we look regionally, we're seeing things play out in a different matter. And then what we've got to do is look at lockdown versus lockdown. And we won't see that until that next quarter. But we hope that this second lockdown will be less of an impact, with more businesses able to stay open and more people having already adapted to the restrictions that was replaced on the government to be able to cope with the pandemic. So let's go into that, looking at the regions. And if we first of all concentrate on the north of England, and there's been a lot of it in the news about how the north of England has been impacted, particularly we were looking at it was the northeast that had a huge increase that was going on in ours. We can see that the average arrears has continued to increase. And while it's played out at that average percentage in arrears, we can see that there's been some play out and it's followed similar patterns. The northeast region is remained the highest in the UK. So if we look at that, 142% of the average rental is the amount that they are getting people in arrears. And they've not seen it. I mean, at 147, it was its highest in May in that northeast. They've had a slight drop off at the first break of lockdown, but it has then continued to steadily increase. But what has they been doing to change that situation? Other than the courts reopening at the end of September, there has been very little for an agent or a landlord to do, and a tenant who's been placed within a redundancy and unable to get back into work to change this situation. So we may start to have seen that some of that is the fact that we've replaced tenancies, and the courts did kick back for a small period of time. But for most of it, we've not been able to deal with that arrears situation. So the average arrears has been unable to us to affect. If we then go on to look at where people are saying regarding what could this be the impact of a tier 3 arrangement? Because the Northwest was particularly under tier 3 for a longer period of time. And while it may have had those drop-offs that we've seen in its amounts, that actually it had an increase in the month of October when it was placed and still within a tier 3 before anybody else was in that tier 3. And that kind of booked that trend, that big increase that it experienced. And the Northeast over that same period of time was starting to be placed in tier 3 restrictions and also saw that impact. So where we had people lobbying that the tier 3 and the impact that it would have, I think within the rental industry, we can also start seeing how that has played out for us, where these tier 3 restrictions. And the fact that we've now come out of a lockdown with more people being placed into higher restrictions, and certainly that playing out for the long term, that while these are being reviewed on a fortnightly basis, there is a strong indication that we are not in a situation to see those being reduced in any kind of meaningful way in the short term. And especially with a relaxing over Christmas, and depending who you speak to, it's between 4 or 5 days worth of full lock, stronger than a tier 3, needed to overturn every day of relaxing, that we could be in for this tier 3 longer. And if that has an impact in people's ability to pay the rent, then we need to look at what that would mean to us within our industry. If we then move and look at the middle of England, so we're dealing with East, West Midlands and the Eastern, then again, we've seen some drops across the East Midlands when we look at the percentage of tenants in arrears over this last quarter, but they have had a tick up in 2 of those regions in that last month, in that run up in November. Again, we're saying we've not seen that true impact of what's happened. But when we look at this, Eastern has remained the worst. So across the UK, it had the lowest reduction in the number of tenants in arrears across all regions, with only 2% of tenants managing to get themselves out of arrears over the past 3 months. It's still a decrease. Other regions have higher number of tenants in arrears, so it's been easier for them to make that reduction. So we do need to take that into account, that starting position as a percentage of the amount making a change also needs to be looked at. If we look at the south of England, it's the same pattern as what we've actually seen. So it doesn't really make much of an impact looking at these different regions if we look at these patterns. But let's talk London. I know people don't like us to necessarily mention London because it seems anomalous, but across the region, more London tenants are in debt than anywhere else. Those in debt owe an average, though, of less than 1 month's rent, 96.9%. That is the lowest in our stats across the UK. There's a number of things that could be speculated as to why this is. We tried to do some analysis as to whether this was tenants making partial payments, so they're in arrears, but not to the same extent that miss a month's rental payment. This would help bring down that average arrears, but unfortunately, we're talking averages rather than the number of pounds owed. So as rent is more expensive in London, while a tenant may owe less than a month, for the agents in London, the amount that they're actually missing could actually be quite substantial. And we're also doing it as a percentage of that total rent arrears. So are we seeing people who are in smaller properties being the ones that are struggling? There are a number of factors that could play out with that. So it's great that we've got the data and it shows us where those regions are happening generally, but it is something that we need to bear in mind what rents are paid and what we've actually experienced within that region as a whole. The last slide I'm going to come on is to look at the devolved areas for arrears before we actually go into the survey information. And here we're looking at Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and it has completely changed. What we've actually seen is the devolved governments having different lockdown regimes, different tiers, different expectations of what people can do. Courts able to deal with evictions in different timelines. So it is never going to play out the same as what we saw within the England regions. What we can look at and see that Northern Ireland definitely stands out. So tenants in Northern Ireland owe the most as a percentage of total rent, owing almost 6 weeks rent to all of their landlords and agents. And while this number is high, it has actually come down 12.6% between October and November. So hopefully that trend will continue. It could be that as we see this come out of their lockdown and we see their play out to how people settle into this new regime, that we can see how that trend will be affected. If we then look north of the border and we look at the Scottish tenants, over the past 3 months, 3.8% of Scottish tenants have been able to get out of debt. And currently the country enjoys the lowest number of tenants in arrears anywhere in the UK. So what are we looking at there? Why have they been able to pay up? What have they been able to do as assistance? Or is it the fact that there are other factors that have taken into play where people have been more pragmatic in their approach? As we know, Scotland has already changed and has been running on private residential tenancies rather than assured short-hold tenancies for a number of years now. And that protection of tenure given during that, and arrears being the one caveat to be able to go to the housing tribunal, as that has made more tenants open to having the communication. In some of the communication we've had with our agents asking that question, it has certainly been a factor that actually that protection of tenure that they have only being threatened by the arrears has opened those communication channels and made them more open to be looking at making that payment for rent. Where we also looked at, if we look at what's actually affected and how people have behaved over these last quarter, we've seen Wales with the biggest drop. Across the UK, as a percentage of average arrears, across Wales, they had the biggest reduction at 32.2% over the past 3 months. So while that was already at its high and had started to come down, as they came out of their lockdown, and they came out their lockdown at a different timing to England, are we seeing that play out in a way that may play out for the UK? Or because that was able to play out in November, unfortunately, are we going to be hit with that seasonal bump that I mentioned earlier that we experience anyway with those personal finances? So that's it for the arrears. I've got more information on that, and we will get this out as a report that will go down to everybody who has registered. It'll also be being sent out as part of our CEO newsletter, and it has some more detail around where we got those numbers and what it can actually tell us from. But what we now want to go into is actually this rental confidence index that we did, asking about the pandemic and its impact to everybody involved: agents, tenants, and landlords. I'd mentioned a few points of this on the data. So this actually took place between the 1st and the 7th of December. The final collection of this data was actually on Monday. So we have worked round the clock. I must put a shout out to my data team and everybody within the marketing to get this ready. But this is the freshest look of the impact and was actually taken as we come out of lockdown. So we can actually get the view of what people are saying regarding the current situation. Agents that were surveyed were both PayProp and non-PayProp users. We went out through our networks and our affiliates to make sure that more people were able to give a voice. We, unfortunately, both our tenants and our landlords, as I explained, we were only able to go through, due to GDPR, people who we could gain the authorization to contact to ask them to take part in this survey. So because of that, when we look at the tenants and landlords, however, that is thousands and thousands of tenants and landlords that have been surveyed. So it is giving us a good view as to what the market and their sentiment is. So one of the first things we went out to our tenants and actually looked at their attitude towards arrears. If we're going to be looking at arrears data and saying what we are experiencing, how is the tenant feeling about their arrears position? And as you can see, that in some ways, are these payment pains being overstated? If we listen to the head of shelter and the lobbying that's taking place now, then tenants need more because every tenant is actually in a challenging situation. But 30.1% of tenants have found it more difficult to pay the rent. That doesn't mean that they haven't paid the rent. As we can see, our statistics and our national averages show that it's less than that. They're just expressing a sentiment that it became more difficult to pay the rent. But in a separate survey question, we asked how concerned they were about their tenant arrears, and then being able to pay that. And only 11.2% were concerned or very concerned about their ongoing rent arrears. Now, from somebody with any interest, they could say they're just not concerned. They're quite happy for it to grow. But I think the sentiment of the people we engaged with from the tenants is they were actually looking at this from their point of view, not what to say to an agent. So crucially, 77.3% of tenants actually marked down that they were not worried about future rent arrears and what that may mean to their tenancy. So the rent will continue to be repaid by the vast majority of tenants. So while the market may tell us different, actually what we are experiencing and what tenants feel is actually more in line with what we expect within the market, that where tenants are able to pay, they are paying. There will always be outliers, and there were people that will use any situation. I talked to a number of agents at the start of lockdown, when lockdown was then happening so close to the moratorium on evictions that they were seeing that as an announcement to not pay. I don't think that's what we've experienced. That's not to say that we won't have encountered those. But in our majority, what we're actually seeing is where tenants are able to, they are behaving responsibly. But it is coming down in one of the questions that savings are saving the day. Because how will these 30.1% who will find it more difficult continue to get hold of the money needed? So data from the latest household finance index from the IHS market, it kind of paints a picture that when we look, there's been more of a strain than any point in the last 6 months on household finances. And as a result, household savings has fallen at its quickest rate in 7 years across the whole of the UK. So if we, over this period of time, have declined by using savings to supplement income, then at some point those savings diminish to the point where they're no longer able to pay the rent. So we need to keep an eye on that, and more, we need to keep those communication open. But if we can see people from these savings and they're entering a point, what's happening regarding government support? So we asked the question, do you think the government has provided enough support? And we asked that separately to tenants, landlords and agents. And it doesn't matter. The government may be telling us that they're providing support, but the message is definitely not getting through. Across the rental sector, it's one of the few questions that everybody agreed that available government support has not been adequate. The vast majority of them were actually thinking that it's not been enough support, or were unsure if the support had been given. Could be down to poor communication, last minute nature of the changes. As I mentioned, furlough, everybody made plans. As businesses, we had to plan. but we're actually finding that things have changed and mixed messages come out. Confusion over what we can and can't do. Eviction changes that make it to the point where a tenant or a landlord, never mind agents that operate in this sector day in, day out, understanding. So headlines claiming a complete ban, despite the processes still needing to be taking place to get us there. It does tell us that more support is needed. For many agents, the stamp duty holiday was viewed as a positive government interaction. We had a lot of interaction with people that I know, that I was speaking to, who were saying that they'd seen that help stimulate the sales market. However, when we did our survey of agents, only 44.9% offered sales as part of their service, meaning more than 50% of the agents that we surveyed will see no direct impact. They were lettings only agencies. So that increased demand for sales will not result in the increased commission. They may see landlords using this as a way of increasing their stock, where they may see some residual benefit. So then we actually went on to ask tenants. And, you know, local grants have been available to tenants who have struggled on the discretionary housing payments. We've had eviction bans, we've had furlough, but they still, as far as tenants were concerned, they were not overly sure that enough support had been given. So only 16.4% felt there'd been enough support and they needed more. And when we look at landlords, a lot of people, when they talk about this, say, yeah, but we put in mortgage holidays. They've been available to landlords owning a mortgage on a buy-to-let property since the start of the first lockdown. But other than that, for landlords, there's not been much support. And this had the lowest approval level, was from landlords in what the government have done at 11.2%. But we also asked kind of the makeup of where people are. And we've got a lot of retired or nearing retirement landlords. 63.8% of the landlords surveyed fell into that category. And they may have rent being their main source of income. Quite often their buy-to-let may be low or zero mortgaged. So tenant arrears and eviction bans could hit these majority of landlords disproportionately. And if they've got few other sources of income, such as employment or a substantial private pension to put that up, then this could be a source of the pessimism that we're seeing within this landlord group. So if it comes down to the poor communication as being an issue, because the government has definitely given some support, but that confusion and that communication has become an issue. Have we learned from what the government has told us? And as an industry, have we provided better communication during this period of time? So we asked that to all of the different groups. Have you had more, less, or the same level of contact during COVID? And overwhelmingly, agents have been making more communication. In their view, they have been contacting landlords and tenants considerably more than they would have in the pre-pandemic era. But that's not being heard, because by the same, we actually only have 10.9% of tenants that are actually saying that they're actually getting more communication. And the same regarding when we look at landlords, they're not seeing that. So it was the smallest proportion of landlords that were noticing the increase in communication. So as the pandemic progresses and we get evictions restarting in 2021, it is certainly that communication is going to play a vital role. And although we are doing that communication, are we making enough notice that communication? Or are we actually, it being a factor that messages are hitting the target, but they're not actually aimed at a blanket communication? That I am communicating more as an agent, but I'm communicating where it is required. So I'm not communicating to all tenants. I'm communicating the tenants that are experiencing difficulty. And I'm not communicating more to all landlords, because if the landlord is seeing no impact from the pandemic, what it actually means is, as an agent, we're targeting that communication where it is most likely to provide the best assistance, where we can use that market knowledge, that expert advice to help that situation. But should we be doing more to make sure that all of our landlords and all of our tenants are aware that this is what we are actually doing and what we're providing? Or for the majority that are actually that 69.9% of tenants that haven't found it difficult, and those subsequent landlords that have not seen an impact to the rent, is the extra work that we're doing during the pandemic going unnoticed? So then we kind of said, well, we're ending 2020, we're coming into 2021, and the announcement yesterday of the first people in the UK actually getting the vaccine, and there were some great stories about both key workers and people in high-risk categories who were getting that. But what does that mean? What does 2021 bring for us within the rental market? Because this light at the end of the tunnel, how quickly will that actually impact us? What is our view? So we actually asked agents, how likely are they to be working in the property industry? And we also asked them how optimistic they were about the future. And agents are committed. Despite a difficult 2020, agents are confident about the future of the rental industry as we head into 2021. Yeah, 83.7% of respondents likely or very likely to still be working in the property industry in 2025. And 71.4% optimistic or very optimistic about the future of the industry. So when we looked at other things, more than 50% of respondents have considered buying another agency. And 77.6% of agents have considered increasing the number of managed properties as a key contribution to their future revenue growth. So certainly rentals is something that's playing a huge part in how we see this market working. We also asked, and technology is definitely key. As one of the first industries to reopen after the initial lockdown, we had to find our way to deal with social distancing, to deal with unable to attend virtual viewings, more documentation. And over 2/3, 77.6% of agents have increased their use of technology during 2020 since the start of the lockdown. 57.1% see technology, including 3D tours and virtual viewings, as a key value business add, not just for them now, but also in their future, that they've done it out of necessity, but have actually found huge beneficial changes, be that in overhead reduction or in their ability to actually run faster. What we've actually found is the new let from home agencies have adapted to these social distancing rules. And while 63.3% of the agencies that we spoke to already have their whole team back to the office, 16.3% do not expect to see their entire return to the office, instead choosing to work from home. And the technology that they've pioneered, as we said during that 2020, will allow them to be just as productive, if not more so, working from home than they could ever be in the office during 2021. So it provides that flexibility. New PayProp clients, we've actually done surveys and asked them. And we particularly looked at one for a case study, and One Stop Properties joined us during 2020. And they've managed to increase their efficiencies through automation. And we expect that more agencies that will do this. The 73% that agree it's more productive to increase automation than to increase the workforce. But for different people, that means different things. Just like it did when we saw the regions and we saw the way that played out in the devolve, it means different things. What does automation look like is different for each agency. And what we need to do as 2021 looks like being a longer time for us to see things get back to a semblance of anything pre-lockdown, we need to take that time to adjust and make sure we assess that key technology correctly. So if we're going to look at that from an agent, then we ask what we might bring for our tenants. Because obviously our tenant sentiment in this really leads what we might do with our technology, because that helps us. And actually, tenants are here to stay. The trials of 2020 may have had an impact on tenants, and we had 34.3% that were rethinking where they currently live. 36.4% of the tenants that we actually looked at were either working part-time or permanently from a home as a result of the pandemic. But the long-term prospects also look very encouraging. You know, 55% of tenants still expect to be renting in 5 years' time. This tracks with all of the statistics that we're seeing, particularly with you as we've got an aging rental population. So we're actually seeing that more long-term stability. And if anything from the pandemic, people are looking for that long-term stability. We've seen a change in what people are looking, and we highlighted that with the Visit Britain, but actually in our own survey, it plays out the same. You know, people are looking for different things in their property now. Before, it might have been an easy commute to get in. It is certainly now that outside space. When they spend more time at home, it becomes a key priority. 32.7% of tenants that don't currently have an outside space at their property, 89.8% would have wanted it or would look for it in any future rental. So this change, when we see a softening demand for rental properties in inner cities, while they may have been convenient, tenants now don't seem to be afraid to move. And despite the continuing threat of COVID, a minority, 14.9%, are being put off moving their property because of the pandemic. And we've seen that with the record numbers that we've seen and been shouted by the different people, your property marks, the guild, they've all seen that increase in demand. So if tenants are here to stay and agents are here to stay, what about our landlords? We've seen landlords be hit over these past few years with increasing tax, different things being done. We've even heard that there may be an increase in capital gains tax as a way of paying back the debt raised by the arrears. But when we actually spoke, property hasn't lost its shine. Yeah, just 62.2% of landlord surveys expect to still be landlord in 5 years' time. And more letting agents expect the same. So it's encouraging to see that a large section of landlords are still committed to remain within that private rented sector. There will be always people who it's no longer right for them. But then we started looking at, is inheritance an issue? Because the 17.8% who won't be in the industry by 2025, it may be less significant than it seems, but you know, we need to look. Those with the foresight to use rental income to top up the pension may also be considering the inheritance tax implications of rental properties. If the property was sold, if it was gifted to children or family members, and the landlord lived on for more than 7 years, the money could be gifted. So there are a lot more questions than just about the current tax implications or what capital gains. And yes, why it was great to see a small time stamp duty lift. What happens in the long term? Because we've got landlords who are still haven't lost its shine, but we need to make sure that we are still doing everything that those landlords stay within our industry. And there are some that want more. So we also see that while landlords, there were some that expect to leave the private renter sector by 2025, a considerable amount of those landlords are looking at adding properties to their portfolio. Despite the difficulties in the industry faced in 21, despite the pandemic. So we should still see a steady supply of rented housing stock remaining during 2021. But what we actually need to look at is, what does this mean to us moving into the following years? If capital gains becomes another impact, how do we show our value as agents? How do we keep on top of that situation, that income, and be putting ourselves as that vital part of the resource where we can help our landlords stay within the rental sector? Now, I typically go on and at this point ask for questions, but during the webinar, what I've actually found is people afterwards have reached out. So we will be putting this into a report, putting a little bit more information around the numbers and providing some of those key graphs that I mentioned, some of the statistics in the questions that we asked. We will be running this on, and let's see our first full review come after February of next year. In March, let's look at what it means for a year. But for most of you, we will get this out. It will have the reply to have the questions. Anybody who has registered, whether you've been able to attend or not, we will get this out to you. And let's run through this Christmas period. Let's take part in the festivity. It is being relaxed. but let's stay safe. Let's help our landlords and our tenants to stay safe. And let's see how in 2021, we can go through the strength, because this may have been challenging. And it doesn't matter whether less than a year ago, we'd never heard of self-isolating. I've had words that have been mentioned to me, such as blur's day, the feeling during lockdown of one day rolling into another. These are all things that we've adapted and changed our vocab, our way of working, as we said, our technology, the way we interact with our staff and our clients. But we've thrived. As an industry, we were shown that confidence at the end of the first lockdown, and we have done well with it. A phrase used continually throughout the industry is this health before wealth. Both have followed. We have looked after our tenants and landlords during that period, and subsequently that has then looked after us. But we need to continue doing the same, and we need to make sure that our efforts don't go unnoticed. So make sure that the technology that you are using is helping with that communication, showing people what you are doing, keeping you front and center with those landlords and with those tenants. If there are, I will go to any questions that we've got, but please don't feel you need to do that during the webinar. As I say, I will send this out as a recording and with the report, and that will have my details and emails, because I know from the previous two, people have felt it easier to ask that question because it's been more unique to the agency situation. And quite often, talking about our arrears positioning or how we may want to address something that's happening, we don't necessarily want to do in an open forum with a lot of our peer group and the people that operate within our industry. But thank you very much for attending this webinar. I will just now see if there's anything that I need to address within the questions. Okay, there's a couple that I will get to, but they've actually asked to speak afterwards. So I will go and speak afterwards and actually drop that as a question. If anybody needs anything further in relation to themselves as a PayProp customer, please remember our support is always there to assist, and we are always there to listen to our customers. So if there's something that you would like to see in our next webinar that you think around that arrears data would help you as a business, we're happy to take any suggestions. I'm not saying we can automatically do it, but we do have that data, and we want to make sure that what we are providing is the most impact and assistance for our agents to provide a best service to their landlords and tenants. Thank you very much for attending another PayProp Rental Trends webinar, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.